He had kissed his wife goodbye at the front door at 6:15 that morning. He had told her the flight was at 8, that he would be in London by evening, that the meetings would run through Friday and he would be home Saturday. She had smiled and told him to travel safe and to text her when he landed. He had driven to the airport. He had sat in the departure terminal for 40 minutes. Then he had taken his bag, left the terminal, got in a cab, and gone to a restaurant in the city where he had reserved a table under a different name 3 days earlier. He had not told his wife he was coming back. He had not told anyone. He sat at the table he had chosen specifically, corner position, partial sight line to the entrance, seated facing away from the door so that anyone who came in would not see his face. He had brought a book. He had ordered dinner. He had prepared to wait as long as it took. At 7:45, the couple arrived. His wife, Sandra, came in first. The man with her, the man holding her hand, the man who held the door for her, the man who put his hand on the small of her back as the host led them to their table, was named Craig Elton. Craig Elton was the founder and CEO of Elton Group, a competing firm in the commercial development sector that had spent 3 years systematically underbidding Daniel Cole's company on contracts, poaching his clients, and appearing, not coincidentally, to know things about Daniel's strategies that competitors should not have access to. Daniel sat 3 tables behind them. He picked up his book. He did not read it. He listened. And what he heard in the next 90 minutes was not just the worst night of his marriage. It was the reason his company had been bleeding for 3 years, and it was going to be the foundation of the most important business move he would ever make. Please like this video. Seriously, hit that button right now. Those likes are what makes stories like this reach the people who need to hear them. Subscribe too. It costs nothing, I promise. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back to how Daniel ended up in that restaurant. Daniel Cole was 45 years old and had built Cole Development Group over 17 years into one of the leading mid-market commercial real estate development firms in the region. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make decisions in anger. He did not operate on instinct when data was available. His colleagues described him, not always as a compliment, as someone who would spend a week analyzing a decision that most people would make in an afternoon and who was almost always right. He had built his company the same way, methodical, documented, grounded in the reality of what was in front of him rather than the story he wished was true. It was that quality, the willingness to look at what was actually there, that had made him a good businessman. It was also that quality that had made the past 3 years increasingly difficult to explain to himself. 3 years ago, Cole Development had been on the verge of what would have been the most significant growth period in its history. 2 major contracts, both near finalized, a partnership with a national investor group, a pipeline of projects that represented everything Daniel had been building toward. Then Craig Elton had appeared. Not suddenly, Craig's company had existed for several years, but it had been a different category of player, smaller, less sophisticated, operating in different market segments. Until 3 years ago, it wasn't. Craig had started appearing in the same processes as Daniel, bidding on the same contracts, approaching the same clients, and winning, not because his proposals were demonstrably better, but because they kept arriving with pricing structures and service specifications that were almost precisely calibrated against what Daniel had submitted. Not similar, calibrated. The kind of calibration that comes from knowing what you're calibrating against. Daniel had hired a consultant 18 months ago to review his internal security, information governance, access controls, who had visibility to what and when. The consultant had found no clear breach. He had not found nothing. He had found something he described as circumstantially concerning. Patterns of information timing that suggested someone with internal access was communicating externally in ways that were not formally detectable. Someone with internal access. Daniel had thought about that finding for 18 months. Sandra Cole was 43 and had been married to Daniel for 12 years. She was not someone Daniel had ever had reason to question. She was warm and capable and had been, in the early years of the company, genuinely involved in its operations, reviewing proposals, attending client dinners, the kind of partnership that small companies build when everyone wears multiple hats. As the company had grown and professionalized, her formal involvement had reduced. She had her own work, a senior marketing role at a non-competing firm, and her own schedule, and their lives had developed the adjacent but separate quality that many dual-career marriages develop over time. He had not been suspicious of Sandra. He had been suspicious of a pattern. He had known, going into the fake business trip, that the dinner he had tracked through a calendar notification that had briefly appeared on a shared tablet before Sandra deleted it, was happening at this restaurant on this night. He had not known who the dinner was with. He had come to find out. He had not anticipated Craig Elton. He had not anticipated what he would hear. Craig Elton was 48 and had spent 3 years winning in a market where his firm's track record did not fully explain his wins. He was confident in the way of someone who has been getting away with something long enough that the caution has faded. He was also, Daniel would discover, in love with Sandra in the specific inconvenient way of someone who has convinced themselves that what they are doing is justified. The restaurant had good acoustics for a purpose it hadn't been designed for. Daniel sat with his book open and his ears completely available and listened to his wife and his business rival discuss their relationship over a meal that probably cost as much as some of Daniel's smaller line items. The first 15 minutes were personal. He heard them and filed them with the specific controlled grief of someone who has arrived prepared for pain and is managing its arrival. He had known something was wrong with the marriage. He had not known this. He sat with it. He breathed. He turned a page of the book he was not reading. Then the conversation shifted. Sandra said something about a proposal. Craig said something about timing. Sandra mentioned a bid process that Daniel recognized immediately, a commercial development project with a regional transportation authority that Daniel's team had spent 6 weeks preparing a response for. Sandra said the submission window closes Thursday. His team is at $312 per square foot. The service specification is the standard package, but they've added the sustainability audit component to differentiate. Craig said, "That's helpful. We can come in at $298 with a matched service structure." "Is the sustainability piece a hard requirement or a value add?" Sandra said, "Value add. It won't affect scoring. They just wanted to look good." Daniel turned a page. His face was the face of a man reading a book. His hands were not entirely steady. He had just heard his wife deliver a precise summary of his company's proprietary bid on a live contract to the man who would use it to undercut him. He had just heard it, not suspected it, authorized it, heard it in her voice, at a dinner table 3 tables away. He had 2 instincts simultaneously. The first was to stand up, walk to the table, and say everything. The second, and this was the instinct that had made him the businessman he was, said not yet. Not yet because what he had heard was the affair and the leak, but it was not the full picture. Not yet because the merger he was 3 weeks from finalizing was the biggest transaction of his career, and Craig Elton had also been pursuing it. And if Craig knew what Daniel knew about the merger terms, Daniel needed to understand how much he knew and how to use that. Not yet because walking to that table tonight gave him 12 seconds of satisfaction and handed both of them time to manage what came next. He turned another page. He ordered dessert. He sat for 90 minutes and listened to everything they said. He wrote nothing down he didn't need to. He drove home that night to an empty house and sat at his kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything he had heard in order with timestamps until 2 in the morning. Then he called his attorney. "Please like this video right now. I am asking you because these likes matter more than you know. Hit that button. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from?" Now let's talk about what Daniel built in the 3 weeks between that dinner and the merger meeting. Daniel's attorney was a woman named Rebecca Walsh, who had handled his company's legal affairs for 11 years and who received his call at 2:15 in the morning with the composure of someone who understood that calls at that hour were important. He told her what he had heard. She said, "Don't move anything. Don't change anything visible." "Don't let them know you know," he said. "I know." She said, "We need to talk about the merger." The merger was with Whitfield Capital, a national investment group that had identified Daniel's company as the right vehicle for a significant commercial development expansion. The deal had been in negotiation for 4 months and was approaching the final term sheet stage. Craig Elton had also been in conversation with Whitfield Capital. He had not been in the final term sheet stage. This was because Daniel's pitch had been stronger, but Daniel now understood that Craig's attempt to be in the conversation at all had been enabled by information about Daniel's approach that he had no legitimate way to know. Rebecca said, "If we play this correctly, we can use the merger meeting to expose the information leak in a context where Craig's conduct and Sandra's conduct are both on the record with Whitfield present." Daniel said, "Walk me through it." She walked him through it. He spent 3 weeks preparing 2 things simultaneously. The first was the merger documentation. Everything Whitfield needed, complete, airtight, presented with the thoroughness that had been Daniel's professional signature for 17 years. The second was a trap, not a dramatic one, a corporate one. His internal team was given modified information on 3 specific elements of the merger terms, numbers and specifications that were plausible but subtly incorrect. The modifications were documented and dated. If those specific numbers appeared in Craig Elton's competing bid or in any public statement by Craig's team before the meeting, the source of the leak would be mathematically identifiable. They appeared. Craig's revised proposal to Whitfield, submitted 10 days before the meeting, contained 2 of the 3 modified figures. Daniel's attorney had a forensic accountant document the correlation before the meeting date. The merger meeting was held in a conference room at Whitfield Capital's regional offices. Daniel arrived with Rebecca, his CFO, and 2 members of his board. Craig arrived separately, having been invited to present a competing proposal, a standard Whitfield process that Daniel was aware of and had prepared for. What Craig did not know was what was in the room. What Sandra did not know was that Daniel had filed for divorce 2 days earlier at a courthouse on the other side of the city, with documentation that included the restaurant conversation transcribed from his 2 in the morning notes, the subsequent discovery of a pattern of information transfers that Rebecca's investigation had identified across 14 months, and the forensic correlation of the modified figures. The meeting ran for 4 hours. The first 3 hours were standard, Whitfield's team working through both proposals, asking questions, reviewing documentation. In the fourth hour, Whitfield's lead partner, a careful man named Thomas Harris, paused the meeting. He said he had a procedural matter to raise. He presented with the specificity of someone who had been briefed the correlation between Daniel's proprietary proposal data and the numbers in Craig's competing submission. Craig's attorney, who had not been told about this possibility, said nothing for a moment. Craig said, "I don't know what you're suggesting." Thomas Harris said, "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm presenting a documented correlation that requires explanation." Rebecca Walsh from Daniel's side of the table provided the explanation. She provided all of it. Craig Elton left the meeting early. His attorney followed him. The merger between Cole Development Group and Whitfield Capital was finalized 6 weeks later. Craig Elton's company, Elton Group, faced a civil action for trade secret misappropriation that Daniel's team filed the following week. The action was supported by the forensic documentation Rebecca had assembled across the 3-week preparation period. The civil case proceeded. The resolution, when it came, was expensive for Craig. His firm's credibility in the regional market, built substantially on wins that were now retroactively questionable, did not survive the coverage of the civil action. Sandra's attorney received the divorce filing 3 days after the merger meeting. The documentation Daniel's team had assembled covered 14 months of information leakage, the correlation between Sandra's access to his home office materials and the timing of Craig's competitive intelligence on Daniel's proposals. The marital asset implications were significant. Sandra had called Daniel once after receiving the filing. He had answered. She said, "Daniel," he said, "my attorney will handle everything." She said, "Can we talk about this?" He said, "We talked. You told Craig my bid was at $312 per square foot and the sustainability component was a value add. I was sitting 3 tables behind you, a very long side." He said, "Take care of yourself, Sandra." He ended the call. Daniel moved through the following year with the same methodical pace he brought to everything. The merged entity, Cole Whitfield Development, was structured with Daniel as majority controlling partner and CEO. It was a larger business than he had operated before, with access to capital he had not previously had, and the combination produced the growth opportunities he had spent years positioning for. He was not untouched by what had happened. He was honest about this with his therapist, who he saw every other week for the first year, and with his friend Marcus, who had known him for 22 years and who had sat with him in the week after the restaurant and not said anything that wasn't worth saying. He missed the marriage he had believed he was in. He did not miss the marriage he had actually been in. There was a difference, and it took time to live inside that difference clearly. He was working on it. In the second year after the merger, he hired a head of business development whose job was, in part, to monitor competitive intelligence, to understand what was known about Cole Whitfield externally, and to ensure that the company's proprietary information was governed with the rigor that Daniel now understood was non-negotiable. He ran the company. He was good at it. He drank his coffee at his desk every morning and looked at the city through the window and thought about the next decision rather than the previous ones. It was not a perfect life, it was a real one, and that he had decided was better. Daniel Cole sat 3 tables behind his wife and his business rival, listened to everything they said, wrote it down at 2 in the morning, and spent 3 weeks building a trap they walked into without understanding what it was. He did not confront them in the restaurant. He did not confront them at home. He waited. He prepared. He let the merger meeting be the moment. Was that the right call? He got the outcome, the merger, the civil case, the divorce on his terms. But he also spent 3 weeks living in his house knowing what he knew and saying nothing, and going to work every day managing a situation he had not chosen. Here's the question. Do you think Daniel's patience was strategic brilliance, or was waiting the decision that cost him most? If you had been in that restaurant and heard what he heard, could you have waited 3 weeks to act? Or would you have needed to say something that night? Drop your answer in the comments, real ones only, and tell me where you're watching from. Like this video, those likes matter so much, and if this story delivered for you, that button is right there. Hit it. Share this with someone. Subscribe if you haven't. You've been here 10 minutes. You know what this channel is about. See you in the next one.